How does a country just stumble into a civil war? It's almost never one single thing, but every once in a while, one law, one single act of Congress can be the match that lights the whole tinderbox. Today, we're talking about one of those moments.
And yeah, that's a huge question, right? Can one law really be the thing that tears a country apart? Well, if you look at the story of the American Civil War, a lot of people point to a law from 1854 as the absolute point of no return.
And that's really the heart of it, the Kansas-Nebraska Act. We're going to unpack how this one piece of legislation took a nation that was already deeply, deeply divided and basically just slammed the door on any chance of finding a peaceful way out.
But, to really get why this thing exploded, you have to understand the pressure cooker it was dropped into. Before 1854, the United States was already just simmering with tension, barely held together by some pretty fragile politics.
It's kind of wild to think about, but back then, the Republican Party didn't even exist. The two big players were the Democrats and a party called the Whigs. And here's the crucial part. Both of those parties had a foothold in the North and the South. That was the political glue, really. It forced people from totally different parts of the country to try and find some common ground.
So for decades, they kept this fragile peace with a series of really delicate, high-stakes compromises over slavery. Think of them like legislative Band-Aids on a massive, gaping wound.
And these maps really show you what we're talking about. On the left, you've got the country after the Missouri Compromise in 1820. On the right, after the Compromise of 1850. You can see they're both just trying to solve the same explosive problem. How do we keep expanding westward without the whole balance of power between free states and slave states tipping into total chaos?
Okay, so the Missouri Compromise of 1820 was a classic bit of political horse trading. Missouri gets to come in as a slave state, but to keep things balanced, Maine comes in as a free state. And here's the really important part. They drew a line right across the country at the 36-degree 30-minute parallel. The deal was, north of that line, no slavery. Ever. Or so they thought.
Fast forward 30 years, and the whole thing is starting to fray at the edges again. California wants to join the Union as a free state, and it's a huge deal. So the legendary Senator Henry Clay steps in to broker another package deal. California gets to be free, and they'll ban the slave trade in Washington, D.C. itself. But, and this is a big but, the South gets a much, much tougher fugitive slave law. It was another temporary fix, another Band-Aid.
And this is where everything changes. Because in 1854, one very ambitious senator decides it's time to rip all those Band-Aids right off, all for the sake of a totally different project. Meet Stephen A. Douglas. He's a powerful Democratic senator from Illinois, and he has a grand vision, a massive transcontinental railroad connecting the country. And he wants the Eastern Hub to be right in Chicago, where, he just so happened to own a lot of real estate. But to get his railroad built, he needed votes from Southern politicians, and they were going to demand something huge in return.
And what they wanted was a whole new system. Douglas gave it to them. It was a concept called popular sovereignty. On the surface, it sounds pretty democratic, right? Instead of Congress in Washington drawing lines on a map, why not just let the actual settlers in new territories vote for themselves on whether to allow slavery?
This idea became the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. It created two new territories, Kansas and Nebraska. But here's the bombshell. To let them use popular sovereignty, the act had to do something that was once unthinkable. It officially, explicitly repealed the Missouri Compromise. That 36-degree 30 line, that sacred line that had held for 34 years, was just erased. Gone. Suddenly, land that had been promised to be free forever was now up for grabs.
The reaction in the North was just immediate fury. They saw it as a complete and total betrayal. The New York Tribune put it bluntly, the unanimous sentiment of the North is indignant resistance. Douglas himself later said he could travel all the way from Washington back to Chicago guided only by the light of his own burning effigies. People were that angry.
And this wasn't just some abstract political debate in Washington. No, this principle of popular sovereignty immediately exploded into real-world violence, and it completely turned American politics on its head.
Kansas became ground zero. It turns out, letting the people decide wasn't so simple. Thousands of pro-slavery men from neighboring Missouri, they called them border ruffians, just swarmed across the border on Election Day to cast fake votes. They managed to install a pro-slavery government, while the actual anti-slavery settlers there refused to accept it. So what did? They just set up their own government. So now you've got Kansas with two rival governments, and both sides are armed to the teeth.
What followed was a brutal, nasty little preview of the Civil War. They called it Bleeding Kansas. More than 50 people were killed in this guerrilla warfare. This is actually where the abolitionist John Brown first becomes famous, after he led a raid where he and his sons literally hacked 5 pro-slavery settlers to death with swords. Popular sovereignty, in practice, was just pure, bloody chaos.
And this chaos just completely blew up the political system as they knew it. The Whig Party, one of the 2 major parties in the country, was so torn apart by this law that it just collapsed. It ceased to exist. And rising from its ashes in that very same year, 1854, was a brand new party, the Republican Party, formed for one main reason: to stop slavery from expanding. Period. This whole mess also dragged a certain former congressman from Illinois right out of political retirement, a guy named Abraham Lincoln. He was so disgusted by the Kansas-Nebraska Act that he jumped back into politics, speaking out against what he called the monstrous injustice of slavery and becoming one of the most important voices in this new Republican Party.
So you can see where this is all heading, right? The board is set. The creation of this new, purely northern anti-slavery party put the country on a direct collision course for war.
I mean, just look at the timeline. It's a straight shot. 1854, the act passes, the Republican Party is born. Just 2 years later, their first ever presidential candidate wins a third of the popular vote with zero support from the South. And then, by 1860, with the Democrats split, the Republican Abraham Lincoln wins the whole thing.
So let's just put it all together. The Kansas-Nebraska Act was a political earthquake. It tore up a 30-year-old compromise. It killed a major national political party. It created a new, purely regional one. It lit the fuse for a mini-civil war in Kansas. And it put Abraham Lincoln on the path to the presidency. It didn't just make the Civil War possible, it made it probable.
Which leaves us with one last thing to think about. This whole story is a powerful and, frankly, pretty scary reminder of just how fragile political systems can be. It forces you to ask, when the big, difficult compromises that hold a nation together finally shatter, is fighting really the only thing that's left?